The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild and Persona 5. Two fantastic games released in 2017. I know Persona 5 came out in 2016 originally, but Japan doesn't exist, so it's okay. And two games to receive a prequel slash sequel slash spin-off developed by Koei Tecmo in 2020. I know Strikers came out in 2021 in the West, but Japan's the only thing that exists. So it's okay. So are they any good? Yeah, they're pretty alright. But they do have some things to learn from each other, probably. I think that first and foremost, I should say that there are going to be spoilers for both games in case that wasn't obvious enough. So if you haven't finished Age of Calamity or Strikers, then get out. Like the movie. So the concept of a Warriors spin-off isn't anything new. Multiple franchises have already gotten spin-off games in the Musou style, with some like Zelda getting multiple in their own series. The unique thing about AOC and Strikers is that they are, like I said before, a prequel and a sequel respectively. They aren't just non-canon celebrations of a popular series, they actually have an impact on the story they're based on. Sorta. You probably know what I'm talking about already. Age of Calamity, despite being advertised as a prequel, is technically not canon to Breath of the Wild and probably won't be canon to Breath of the Wild 2 when that happens. Strikers, on the other hand, is canon to Persona 5 and has a really well put together story. But you technically don't really have to have played the original game to play this one, though you should. It's not as much of a big deal with Strikers, as that does build on the world and most of the major characters from the original, but it definitely hits harder with AOC, which just kind of starts doing its own thing after a bit. Getting back on track though, the concept of a canon Warriors game is what really stands out here. Both games hold themselves back in some ways to make sure that they tell a full story under the restrictions of the games they're based on. For example, both games limit the amount of playable characters they have in comparison to previous Warriors games and spin-off titles in order to make sure that those characters fit the context of their respective games. Something like the original Hyrule Warriors had characters from throughout the series, not just from one game. You're not going to be playing as Nanako in Strikers though, or as Groose in AOC, and certainly not vice versa. Phantom Groose. The idea of constraining these games a bit to now fit a narrative spanning across multiple titles and genres is something that takes a different approach than the usual fare Koei Tecmo deals with, but it's also interesting to see. I don't mind this take whatsoever, it lets the world of the game expand, something that always helps if you want more people to get invested in a story. It really is just a matter of how well these two games take that approach. Starting with Age of Calamity, the game takes place 100 years before the events of Breath of the Wild. The game originally intends to tell the story of how exactly the events leading up to the Calamity played out, something that was kind of brushed past in the original game. Plus, it doesn't help that pretty much every important character is dead, elderly, or pushed to the side by the time we get to Breath of the Wild. It was a great chance to catch up on how the world worked before the Calamity, and Age of Calamity did just that. Except it didn't. You do get a few moments that develop the characters from the first game, but besides that, AOC decides to focus on the new timeline it's trying to create. If, say, maybe the game took place way before any of the Calamity stuff was brought to light, instead of pretty much exactly when the flashbacks from Breath of the Wild took place, then maybe we could get a good sense of not only the scope of Hyrule, but the characters whose adventures we were too late to see in the first game. For example, the sisterly relationship between Pora and Impa is rarely focused on in either game, which, to be fair, isn't necessary to progress the plot, but would have been a nice thing to add in the game that serves as a prequel. Age of Calamity ends up missing smaller and slower moments like that when it really could have used them to make the player care about Breath of the Wild's universe more. Instead, the game focuses on Astor and this new timeline. Astor is just a nothing character. He doesn't go anywhere, and the most background we get from him is from a text box. Beyond him, though, I think the game is at its best when it focuses on the new characters. Tereko, who talks like R2-D2 and looks like those turret things from Portal, serves as a great role in showing the sorrowful human side of Zelda. Suga is a higher up in the Yiga clan, and he's always serious, cunning, and intimidating, serving as a direct contrast to Koga's sillier personality. Because these are new characters, they feel fresh and like a great way to expand the game's universe. It just sucks that AOC didn't fully commit to this expansion. Strikers, on the other hand, feels like it executed its angle with much more nuance. Now, both AOC and Strikers do a great job of integrating themselves into Breath of the Wild and Persona 5 respectively. They both look exactly like the game they are based on, and they both follow up on what the player has probably already seen. However, like I said before, Strikers' story is very much directly related to Persona 5, to the point where the transition between that game and this one feels almost seamless. Because this game is a sequel and not a prequel like AOC, There's much more creative freedom when it comes to opening up the game's story and characterization. The developers can take the plot wherever they wish, as long as it remains loyal to the original game. Now, how is this done? I'd say very well. In fact, if it weren't for the radically different gameplay loop of Strikers compared to 5, you would think that this game has no relation to a Musou title whatsoever. Dialogue sections feel like they're taken straight out of the original game, and the story seems to be a natural progression of the original without really being directly connected to it. Again, you don't need to play the original game technically, but you very much should. Your party members are the same as ever. Ryuji is still brash but well-intentioned, Morgana still hates it when you call him a Felis Catus, etc. However, even your existing cast is naturally expanded upon. For example, Yusuke's initial and final interactions with Natsume expand on Yusuke's view of the ideals of an artist and how he should live his own life. Oh, and then there's the third jail, where we get a deeper dive into Haru's past and her relationship with Hyodo, her sort of mother figure. It's a great way to follow up on the Okumura arc of the original game and finally give it all a happy ending. Because if you play the original game, you know. Speaking of jails, yes, the game changes up where you're going, and there are very good reasons for that. I do have my own set of problems with the jails, but those are things I can't really compare to AOC, so I won't be discussing them here. But considering Peace Studio did end up working alongside Omega Force to develop this game, it is a bit unfair to compare it to Age of Calamity entirely, who was solely developed by Omega Force as far as I'm aware. But I don't care, I do what I want. Note number 2. There was originally a note number 1, but I took it out. It is pretty weird going from Persona 5 Royal's more expressive portraits back to Vanilla 5's character portraits and Strikers. Oh yeah, Strikers is canon to the original game and not Royal. So that kinda sucks. I mean, technically it doesn't contradict anything from Royal, so it could be canon, but it doesn't mention anything about it either, so I guess it's up to you. Moving on to gameplay. Age of Calamity plays more like a standard Warriors game. Essentially, your hub is a menu that becomes progressively filled with more and more missions as you complete available story and side missions. Side missions usually come with some flavor text to add to the world building, but they're really just there for practice and to gain resources. Story missions, on the other hand, are pretty self-explanatory. Wawa, you know what this game is. Your battles take place in a large area with a range of 1 to 4 characters that you can switch between. Your battles take place in a large area with a range of 1 to 4 characters that you can switch between and control at all times. The basic strategy becomes kind of like baseball, where you want to place those guys with the catcher's mitts at good positions so that you can minimize the damage caused by the batter. You know, if catchers were one-man armies who could decapitate dozens of people at once, I like, oh shit. Also, I don't know baseball. I don't know what I'm talking about. Basically, Age of Calamity is all about strategic placement and field management. Strikers, on the other hand, is more about in-the-moment strategy, akin more to the turn-based RPG it's succeeding. This means that instead of managing an entire field at once, the game plays more like an action RPG where the entire party is focused on one fight. Strikers is a linear adventure where individual missions are replaced with a single, constantly progressing story. There are side missions in the form of requests, but compared to Age of Calamity, they're not as in your face. The jails are basically one entire map that your party is free to explore and progress through while either avoiding or fighting enemies. Kind of like the palaces in the first game, but more open. Instead of the entire jail being an open battlefield, battles are started only when you ambush or get ambushed by an overworld enemy. If you're not in the palace, you're in the real world and are free to explore whatever city you're in. Though there isn't much to do besides buy out shops and occasionally hang out with your party members. There are no confidants in this game. And finally, time doesn't progress on its own like in P5. Instead, time progresses when you've done a certain story-based action. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with either game's gameplay setup or presentation. Each game has their own strengths and weaknesses. For example, it's much easier to jump into a fight in Age of Calamity, but the world feels much more interconnected and loyal to its original game in Strikers. It mainly depends on preference and whether you even liked either game's style in the first place. I will say one thing though. The fatal flaw in Age of Calamity's structure compared to Strikers' structure is just how repetitive it can become. You finish a mission, return to the hub, finish another, return to the hub, repeat for hours on end just because of how many missions there are. At a certain point, you can see just about everything you're going to see in the game within each battle, with the rest feeling like more of the same grindy combat until you reach the next story segment, where things actually get interesting. This factor makes everything feel incredibly disconnected and just kind of monotonous after a while. At some point, you're really just going at it for the story and nothing else. This is something that doesn't exist nearly to the same extent in Strikers, since it's just one giant story instead of many chapter selects. Not to say that a chapter-based game can't work. Bayonetta is one of my favorite games that's entirely chapter-based. But the fact that every single task in the game feels divided up gets incredibly tiring after a while. Strikers has its fair share of repetition as well. The game's story can feel samey throughout the first 3 jails, and the fact that at some point, a bit of going back to each jail will be necessary can bog down your experience a bit. But structurally, Strikers is much more enticing moment to moment. When it comes to the basic gameplay of the actual combat, the thing that Musou games are most famous for, and the very thing I continue to neglect mentioning, that's when the games are really at their most similar. And even then, they are pretty distinct in how they handle. The main difference between the basic combos of each game is how they're used. Both games have enemies with armor that you want to whittle down to perform some big attack. AOC reserves this mechanic for bosses and mini-bosses, in which armor breaks after dealing a certain amount of damage. While Strikers has this for every enemy, with some enemies having more armor than others, and the only way to break down that armor is through weaknesses, technicals, or critical hits. In AOC, combos are really just alternate ways of dealing damage. You can use whatever combination of inputs you want as long as they're helping you deal as much damage as possible, with some characters even having added attributes to some of their combos, like Zelda's Sheikah Slate attacks. In Strikers though, some combos will end off with the Persona skill that's, from what I can tell, a bit weaker than manually using the spell yourself, but doesn't cost any SP or HP. You want to use this to your advantage in order to save on some resources in the middle of battle. Maybe you're better off reserving your SP for healing skills instead of attacks. Or maybe you can combo into buffs or debuffs to save your SP for powerful offensive skills. This is incredibly loyal to the game each title is trying to follow. Breath of the Wild is all about finding different ways to approach a situation. You can strike a group of enemies head on, but you can also bomb their campsite or launch some rocks at them. Pretty much any method that works for you works for the game. And AOC brings that concept to a battlefield situation that normally you would think of only having one approach. Sure, Link can use his basic combos to mow down smaller enemies, or you can be a little fancier and mix that in with runes, arrows, or your paraglider. On the other hand, Persona 5 was a turn-based RPG with a set battle style, all about exploiting elemental weaknesses, stat buffs and debuffs, and more. Strikers is much more strict about how you approach a battle than AOC is, meaning you have to think more tactically about the individual battles you're in now. I think one of the things that exemplifies this the most is the fact that in AOC, a single character has the capability of handling a fight by themselves, with the real reason to switch simply being map placement. While in Strikers, a team of 4 is always encouraged to have in individual battles. What I'm essentially trying to say is that it's really cool that you can make 2 games with somewhat similar combat feel like 2 entirely different experiences. The fact that going out of one game and into the other felt refreshing instead of tiring is something that I have to give the team at Omega Force props for. In a way, it's very Platinum Gamesy, where they can make multiple titles that have that basic hack and slash or beat 'em up formula, but are still incredibly unique and fun to play in their own right. Bayonetta feels different from Astral Chain. True. Bayonetta feels different from Astral Chain, which feels different from Wonderful 101. With that being said, some things don't work as well as others. Okay, I'm gonna complain now. Remember how I said in AOC you could use runes to help flavor up battles? Well, you're actually quite limited in how and when you want to use them. When the bomb rune prompt pops up, you want to use your bombs. When the magnesis prompt pops up, you want to use magnesis. You don't want to use these at any other time because they need time to recharge after use, and ignoring the prompt to try something else is pointless because it's A, a waste of an opening, and B, a chance for your enemy to strike at you. And yes, you can use these on groups of smaller enemies like bokoblins, but at that point you may as well just ignore them since, save for a few kill enough enemies missions and monster parts, they're easily avoidable and the game won't punish you for not killing them. Essentially, these runes are actually quite limiting, and the opposite of what I think the approach to AOC should have been. I think if these runes actually had somewhat less prominence, or if they were incorporated into combos instead of just a separate button, then maybe they could have been more flexible to use in basic combat. Again, something like Zelda's Sheikah Slate comes to mind, where the runes are part of her combos instead of just part of a singular button that you can use to automatically activate them. And actually, speaking of enemies, let's talk about that for a second. For a game that's supposed to boast about how many enemies appear on screen at once, the only ones that matter are the big bosses and mini-bosses. The rest have no point and are just there to occasionally get in your way and drop the game's frame rate down to 12 FPS. I get that they're there to make the game look like it's in a war and whatnot, but if the focus of the combat is just around the big guys, why even bother with fodder? Strikers takes a better approach to this, with there being less overall enemies on screen at once, but each enemy is smarter and actually capable of throwing the player off guard if they aren't paying attention. And the enemy variety? Well, AOC sure does have it. No. To be fair, this is the fault of Breath of the Wild, which didn't have much enemy variety to begin with. And AOC does try its best with what it has, incorporating different elements to go along with each enemy. But compared to Striker's shadow variety, bosses, and different personas that you can capture, AOC is an absolute joke. Oh yeah, and the camera angles in this game are horrendous. At least with Strikers, most areas were open enough that you were always a good distance away from the player character to see, well, anything at all. AOC sometimes takes too much from Breath of the Wild and sticks you in a place that wasn't really made for having 20 enemies and too many bosses in one spot. At any point, you could be pinned against the wall and the camera will just not know where to look. It becomes especially infuriating when you realize that wall jumping and your dodge button are mapped to the same thing, which can throw off your entire combo and even get you hit when you otherwise should have easily been able to dodge something. Strikers at the very least does a good job of mapping different actions to different buttons, which to be fair leads to a, shall we say, widespread control scheme? But at least it's better than Sonic Adventure 2 over here. Strikers isn't absolutely free of sin either though. From the get-go, you're given all of your party members and you better learn how each one plays because you're going to be switching between all of them. You need each one because of the weaknesses their spells can bring, since each shadow is weak to different attributes. Remember though, this isn't like the turn-based RPG that is Persona 5. You're not just scrolling through a character's menu this time, you're actually in control of each character and their different movesets in real time. AOC was way more lenient about letting you play as who you felt comfortable with. There were some exceptions, yes, but it was mostly... Whereas Strikers is much more, you get what you get and you don't take her. Like I said before, Strikers is all about exploiting each enemy's weaknesses to an even greater extent than the original game, I would say. At least in Vanilla and Royal, you could at some point get by with a Lucifer and a Yoshitsune. In this game though, even shadows who didn't have a weakness in the original game have one now. And you want to take advantage of that, because unless you want to go the slower route of getting crits or technicals, that's the only way you're going to knock down bosses. Since you want as many ways to hit a weakness as possible, and Joker doesn't have infinite SP or persona slots, you want to have the party member with spells most shadows in that specific jail are weak to. This encourages you to experiment with characters, yes, but it might also force you to use characters you're not so fond of. With the exception of Wolf, who relies on raw power and almighty attacks, and maybe Panther and Queen, who apply elemental attributes to their physical and gun attacks, you're often encouraged to hit enemies with a weakness, technical, or critical instead of just taking them out with combos of your own. You don't really get a chance to experiment unless enemies are underleveled, which, to be fair, the game does a good job of letting you fight such enemies, but I would still rather learn as I go rather than backtrack. I suppose the fact that you can heal both HP and SP anytime you hit a checkpoint should, in theory, resolve this issue, but A, if you're going through a jail for the first time, you don't really know where checkpoints are, nor where more difficult fights are going to be, so messing around might not be ideal, and B, you don't have this luxury for boss fights where you really want to hammer in weaknesses, even if, again, you're going through the game for the first time. It gives little opportunity to really let the player find out how else to approach fights, making combat feel controlling and a bit repetitive. While you do eventually get the chance to get used to how characters play, you don't get the chance to really make those playstyles your own. Oh yeah, like I said before, the game overwhelms you from the start. Not only does it just hit you with every character at once you finish that first small section where you can only play as Joker, with each character, you know, having their own gun attacks, combos, spells, weaknesses, stats, and general playstyles. But remember, you also need to be able to swap between these characters mid-battle. And to top it all off, Joker can obviously have multiple personas, which, while incredibly helpful, means you have yet another thing to memorize or improvise with. It can also be quite a pace breaker, since it takes time to swap between the personas you may need. Alright, one more complaint. Just one more. I swear I can stop anytime I want. No, never mind. That's it. So, putting it all together, what can each game learn from each other? Starting with Age of Calamity, instead of putting all of the combat focus on mini-bosses in AOC while having smaller enemies to the side, maybe try and pull a Strikers by making smaller battles with smarter enemies. I admit it's really cool to look at Monkman toss around tons of Lizalfos for the first 10 minutes. After that, mindlessness just gets boring. I would rather fight a few Lizalfos that are smarter and harder to beat than a ton that don't do anything. It's way more rewarding and it preps you for bigger battles later on. The Striker's approach of just keeping you as vulnerable as your enemy is a great example of this. A group of underleveled Jack Frosts and Liliums can still catch you off guard if they have the chance to exploit your party's weaknesses. Maybe one way of incorporating this into AOC could be through some sort of weapon, technique, or elemental triangle. Since the game already applies elemental attributes to larger pre-existing enemies, they could use this as part of a triangle. Maybe a fire Lizalfo can knock you down or damage you more easily if you're wearing an ice weapon or ice armor. Or maybe, taking a page from Fire Emblem, bokoblins with axes are harder to take down if you use a character with a lance. Or maybe even try incorporating certain combos or even runes into a triangle in a way that doesn't feel as handholdy. You could even incorporate some or all of these at once to keep that sense of approach it your way that was in Breath of the Wild. Or even try something else entirely. You can of course keep the battlefield management. That's part of the game's structure, that makes sense. But maybe instead of the points where you fight mini-bosses all the time, you can instead incorporate fights with multiple enemies who require more strategic approaches. This could also help with the enemy variety. Since most bosses tend to be Hinoxes or Lionels or Guardians repurposed each time, saving them for more important fights while giving bokoblins, Choo-Choos, and Lizalfos more prominence would space out who the player fights. I mean, actual enemy variety could also help with enemy variety, but, AOC's already stuck between a rock and a hard place in that aspect, so I'll give it a pass. I also think that there should be better overall character development structure. Most of the personality that individual characters are given are either lumped into the main story campaign or are in text boxes. The main story bits are done pretty well, but the side missions are such a missed opportunity. Remember, there are a ton of side missions in the game, with many dedicated to specific characters. All of these missions have descriptions to them, but if you're really going out of your way to do these, it becomes a chore to read each individual description. It's pretty likely you'll start skipping them just to get to the combat or turn in your materials. I don't mind having lines of text. It's certainly better than having nothing at all. But an occasional cutscene with a champion or whatnot could have been nice to have. I know this game isn't completely trying to be a prequel, but given that it takes most of Breath of the Wild's characters and keeps them, alive, more moments of characterization should have been a priority. It's an opportunity we don't get with just any other game. Maybe something like a more open bond system in Strikers, or even the Confidant system in P5 would have been a nice way to reward the player for doing side content they may not have wanted to. Maybe Sidon's playstyle wasn't exactly your thing at first, but after doing some of his missions, you may not only get that bonus dirty cutscene between him and Link that you all have been dying for, as it turns out, but you can also get some bonus points or abilities that can be allotted to other characters, and even a firmer grasp of Sidon's gameplay that might make you more comfortable using him during story missions. It's a combination of letting you get to know this character both in terms of personality and in terms of gameplay. It's definitely not a perfect system, and I'm not saying it has to be this way for me to like it, but this is just one idea that can be messed around with to improve long-term characterization in the game. Like I said, they could also have made the game a true prequel and have it take place longer before the Calamity. That may be a better alternative depending on how you look at it. Just some way to make the player care about the characters on screen more often would have kept my attention way more. Finally, fix, what was his name? Astolfo? No, Astor. Yeah, fix Astor. He's a nothing villain, just there to serve as a conduit for Ganon, who himself has no defining traits other than being a big bad bacon in the sky. Why even make such a boring character when you already have Harbinger Ganon right there, who already does his job in a more thematically appropriate way? They didn't even bother giving him a good backstory. All the game tells you is that he was born in a village somewhere in Hyrule. Okay, thanks. I thought that they were going to go somewhere cool with him, but he just kinda stands there. Not even menacingly. He just sucks. Maybe they'll fix him in the DLC, but A, I'm not getting that, and B, I would have preferred him to have been fixed in the base game instead of being part of the we'll do it later mentality. This isn't even something AOC needs to learn from Strikers, it's just basic writing. Oh, and one more thing. Remap the wall jump button. This isn't the Wii, there are more than 2 buttons on the controller. Moving on to Strikers, instead of just forcing the entire control scheme onto the player, try to pace the tutorials to regularly introduce things to the player like an AOC. There are a ton of tutorial prompts at the beginning of this game, and for good reason. The game is complex. Maybe trying to introduce certain things in a more in-person way would work better than simply throwing a prompt with some text on screen. If you want the player to learn how to use guns, give the player control and put them in a situation where they need to use their guns. I guess you could say, where they need to stick to their guns, am I right? Yeah. If you want to teach that some combos lead into persona skills, force a narrow situation where the player is told of this ability and asked to do it. The game just kind of throws you into the fights with some text and hopes for the best. I get that you're supposed to memorize what they tell you on your own, but it really does feel like they leave you in the dark sometimes. Another thing is a feature that is somehow in both AOC and Persona 5, but not here, a guard button. You don't really need it, and pretty much every button on the controller is mapped to something important in Strikers, so you wouldn't really have a place to put it, but the option would be nice. There were times in the game where the amount of enemies at once can get a little overwhelming, and unless I missed something, Tetrakarn and Makarakarn aren't in the game. So having the ability to guard could give the player a moment to kinda slow down and reset what they're doing. I suppose that manually using a persona sorta does this already, but hey, a guard button's pretty cool. The final and main thing that I think Strikers can learn from AOC is to simply give the player more freedom rather than just encouraging the player to spam weaknesses. AOC tends to give the player a lot of room to just figure out what works best with each character for them. If you like Link's Shield Surf, you can figure out combos that go with the Shield Surf. If you prefer Link's Rising Tornado Slash thing, you can focus your attacks around that instead. Like I said before, Strikers is much more constricted in this department, and I think it could benefit from allowing the player to find ways to battle to fit their style, rather than simply pulling them down a road of weakness, dodge attack, hit weakness, repeat until one more, or all out attack. This is probably the criticism I had the hardest part describing or even classifying as a criticism, since I really couldn't decide, at least from a personal standpoint, if this narrow design is crucial to the game's unique combat and loyalty to P5, or if it was in fact a flaw that bogged down the experience of playing the game. The last thing any game should have to do is take away from the very traits that make up its core. And if the design philosophy of Strikers revolves around targeting weaknesses, then that should be less of a general issue with the game and more of a trait which personal preference should dictate is fun or not. I do want to point out that I'm not giving the game's combat nearly enough credit. It is not simply about targeting weaknesses, even though I did make it out as such. There are multiple ways to approach situations within the scope of what the game gives you, and I genuinely think that the developers pretty much nailed what they were going for. The game given here is incredibly fun, and I am all for adapting to a certain playstyle rather than having the game adapt to you. But I don't think it would hurt to loosen up a bit and let physical, in-the-moment gameplay be a bit more creative. You can even see slivers of this in, like I said before, Wolf, who's not only an addition exclusive to Strikers, but also a fighter who revolves around physical combat and is just really fun to ram things with. Incorporating more of that freedom that both AOC and Wolf and Strikers have to the rest of the Strikers cast could make so much of a difference. Again, I may be wishing for too much here, but it's something to take into consideration. And yeah, that's about it. That's really all I wanted to talk about. Both fun games, though I think it's pretty obvious which I lean towards. As for what could have been done next, there will probably be another Hyrule Warriors in the distant future, and I'm sure I wouldn't mind a follow-up to Strikers. Whether it be another sequel to P5 or one to P6 when that comes out in 10 years. There's some really good stuff in these games, and I hope this is what the team at Koei Tecmo builds upon in future Musou games. Whether it be Zelda, Persona, or something else. Mention the Samba de Amigo Warriors game. Oh!